Welcome, students, to anatomy of the urinary or renal system. This will actually be a series of 2 lectures. I guess it doesn't really count as a series then, does it? It's kind of a duo. But one lecture will focus more on kind of the anatomy. The other one on more of what we might say is the functional anatomy. So a little bit about kind of how the urinary system or renal system works. So in terms of what does the urinary system do for us, it is primarily an excretory system. So its goal is to eliminate nitrogenous wastes, nitrogen-containing compounds like urea and uric acid that are waste products of our body's metabolism. We don't want them, we don't need them, so we have to have a way of getting rid of them. But that is not all the urinary system does for us. It also helps us regulate 3 kind of very important homeostatic kind of balances. One of those is our water balance. We don't want to become either dehydrated or actually overhydrated. You can actually be ultra hydrated, which is also not something that's very good for your body. I think, most people are kind of wary, right? You don't want to be dehydrated and have too low, but you also actually don't want to be overhydrated as well. It also helps us regulate several different electrolytes, particularly calcium, sodium, potassium, so that our heart and our brain and our nervous system and muscle system function properly. And then also our blood pH. We need to maintain a slightly basic blood pH in order for our body to function properly, for our proteins not to kind of denature and unfold. And so the urinary system is one of the ways that we can regulate that pH level. In order to carry out all of these functions, essentially what the urinary system does is it filters the blood. You can really kind of think of your kidney as a sieve through which your entire blood volume goes through all the time, and then the kidney kind of filters out the stuff that we don't want or need. Once the filtration process has happened, then the kidney also kind of processes that filtrate. It might reabsorb and kind of retake in things that might be useful, like water, or it might secrete things that we maybe have too much of that didn't get filtered out in the first place because maybe it was too big. But processing that filtrate is also the role of the kidney. And in fact, really the functional unit for your renal system is the kidney. Everything else, the ureters, which drain the urine from the kidneys, the bladder, which stores the urine temporarily, and the urethra, which excretes the urine out of the body, are essentially just tubes and a storage tank through which the urine that was made in the kidneys can travel in order to get out of the body. What really does all of the work of the urinary system, what actually filters and processes the filtrate, filters the blood and processes the filtrate, is the kidney. So the kidneys themselves have a very large blood supply. 2 large renal arteries go to each kidney, and then a renal vein drains into the vena cava, draining the blood from the kidney. In terms of where the kidneys sit, the correct term is retroperitoneal. So they are just posterior to the peritoneal cavity where all of our kind of digestive viscera and urogenital organs are. They are held in place by a couple of different kind of supportive tissue layers. There's the renal fascia, which is connective tissue that kind of helps hold the kidneys in place, and then a fat capsule. So surrounding your kidneys in their retroperitoneal position on either side of the vertebra here is this kind of pad of adipose tissue. And one of the things that can actually happen in, say, bariatric surgery or liposuction, where you lose like a drastic amount of weight very short, like in a very short period of time, the kidneys, when that fat tissue sometimes disappears, the kidneys drop down kind of inferiorly out of position, and that screws up their blood supply, and it totally screws up the functioning of your kidney. And since the kidneys are incredibly vital organs, because they are filtering our blood, that can actually be very damaging to your body. But you can kind of see here where they sit, kind of low here around the 12th rib or so. There are kind of 4 regions to the kidney. The most superficial region of the kidney is the cortex. This is where we find all of our nephrons, which are the parts of your kidney that actually make the urine. The second layer is known as the medulla, which is separated into what we call the medullary pyramids, because they're somewhat pyramidal in shape. Separating the pyramids are columns. They're basically kind of indentations of the cortical tissue. And then the deepest layer of the kidney is known as the renal pelvis. When the urine is made out here in the cortex, it then travels down through the medulla into kind of the apex, right, where we have a little hole. The urine then moves out of the medullary pyramids into what we call minor calyces. The minor calyces then merge with and become a major calyx, and then the major calyces then merge with the pelvis, and the pelvis itself is continuous with the ureter in order to get the urine out of the kidney and eventually, of course, out of the body. I also want to point out the hilum here, which is this kind of indentation. This is where the blood vessels come in and out, and as well as the ureters there. In terms of blood flow through the kidney, I mentioned earlier, very large, healthy blood supply. Pretty much your entire blood volume moves through your kidneys often. I want to say every minute, but quite often. So branching off of the aorta is the renal artery. That's what comes in through the hilum. Once we're into the kidney, the renal artery then will branch into what we call some segmental arteries. The segmental arteries will then branch into interlobular arteries. So if you think of the medullary pyramids as lobes of the kidney, they're interlobular, so between the lobes. The interlobular arteries will then branch into the arcuate artery, right? You see it looks kind of like an arch. So the arcuate arteries. And then branching off the arcuate arteries are these smaller arteries that radiate out into the cortex of the kidney, and so they are called cortical radiate arteries. Branching off the cortical radiate arteries are tons of afferent arterioles, and the afferent arteriole is the first blood vessel that's associated with our kind of functional unit nephron. The afferent arteriole leads into a glomerular capillary bed, a very particular high pressure type of capillary system, and then an efferent arteriole leads out of that capillary. It then leads to a second capillary bed in the kidney, either a peritubular capillary or a vasa recta capillary. Those capillaries are then drained by the cortical radiate veins into the arcuate veins, into the interlobular veins, and then the interlobular veins merge with the renal vein to take us out of the kidney to the vena cava to go back through the whole system. So the arterial flow in and the venous flow out are very similar. The exception is we have segmental arteries between the renal artery and the interlobular arteries, whereas in the venous flow, there are no segmental veins. The interlobular veins merge directly with the vena excuse me, I've got the hiccups a little bit, the renal vein to get us out of the kidney. And one of the things that is very different about our kidneys is that the blood will actually flow through 2 different capillary systems inside the kidney. So not just one capillary system. Once the urine has been made, it is the ureters that take the urine from the kidneys to the bladder. They have a very specific kind of wall structure with a mucosa of transitional epithelium, 2 muscle layers, a longitudinal layer, and then a circular layer, and then adventitia fibrous tissue to kind of wrap around the whole thing. At the distal ends, where the ureters connect to the bladder, if the pressure in the bladder gets too high, they will basically kind of pinch off so that the urine doesn't kind of flow up out of the bladder up, because we don't want the urine to be flowing backwards, of course. In terms of the bladder, it's basically just a big old muscular sac. Typically stores about half a liter of urine, except in times of need, it can actually expand to accommodate about a liter of urine, so double its actual kind of volume. And the reason it is able to do so is because of the mucosa of transitional epithelium, and also because it has lots of kind of folds, what we call rugae, and when the bladder is empty, that you'll have lots of folds in the mucosa of the bladder, and the transitional epithelium will look big and bulbous and squishy. But when the bladder is really full, the folds straighten out, and the transitional epithelium kind of tends to flatten out as well, and so we're able to actually hold more urine than we otherwise would be able to without the kind of folds in the walls and the transitional epithelium. The bladder itself is very muscular. It does actually have an extra layer of muscle, so it has an inner longitudinal layer, a middle circular layer, and then another longitudinal layer. Very, very muscular organ. And then, like the ureters, some fibrous connective tissue in the adventitia to kind of hold it all and surround it and give it a little support and structure. Draining the urine out of the bladder is the urethra, much longer in men than in women because we have to accommodate the male penis, whereas we don't have that in our females. The urethra in men will carry both urine and reproductive secretions, whereas the urethra in females is urine only. There are 2 sphincter muscles. There is an internal sphincter kind of at the kind of base of the bladder. That muscle happens to be involuntary, so you don't have to think about it. It will contract and open when essentially triggered by a reflex. And then at the pelvic floor, there is then an external sphincter that is made up of voluntary skeletal muscle that you have to consciously relax in order for it to open so that you can void your bladder at an appropriate time. And that process of urination is called micturition, and we'll talk more about that in the second lecture.